Nothing in this world is as certain as death and taxes, and this was absolutely true in ancient Rome. The same emperors who made these gorgeous coins you see here did everything in their power to make sure they left your hands and, once again, went back into their coffers, through a number of very creative taxes in pretty much every part of Roman life. You bought or sold something? There was a tax. You worked a certain job? Tax. You died? There was a tax. Yeah, just like today. The list of ways your average Roman was taxed was very long, but there were a few ways the state got money out of people that were really unusual. So let me share with you in this video some of Rome's weirdest taxes. So Roman taxation had to work differently due to the circumstances of the time. The Roman state may have ruled this enormous territory with lots of people and riches that were taxable, but despite Rome's sophisticated administrative machine, at least for the time, we're still talking about a pre-modern state. It was far from the all-seeing states we have today. The comparison is actually relevant because we don't even notice today how much control modern states have over our lives. Most of our transactions, your salary, the things that are registered in your name, like, I don't know, your car, it's all very easily trackable by the state. And they have become really good at extracting value of every aspect of your existence. Regardless of your opinion on taxes, we need to accept states today are very good at tracking us down and taxing us. Rome was different. Tax collectors had no reliable way of following every payment or measuring a person's earnings to impose some kind of income tax in the way we understand it today. For example, there wasn't a way of figuring out at the same marketplace who was selling really well and who was struggling, and then charging a fair percentage of each person. Of course, it was also impossible to keep track of everything produced and sold across thousands of towns and villages, so Roman taxes were usually aimed at things the authorities could identify and attribute to a certain person. These were easier to measure and tax. Here's an easy example of what they could control and tax. Land. Great example. Land could be surveyed and it always had an owner. So from a land of a certain size, you could estimate its agricultural production, how many animals graze that land, the size of your house. No wonder that land ownership taxes were some of the oldest taxes we have records of. Taxes could also be extracted from certain key places where the state knew people would often go through, or value. Taxable stuff would pass through, like some kind of bottleneck. That's where, for example, goods meant for commerce could be inspected as they pass through, like some kind of checkpoint that the state controlled, like a port, a city gate, when stuff was about to enter a market. The borders of an empire were a good example. It was impossible, for example, for Rome to patrol all of its border, the entire extension of it, but they knew everyone entering Roman lands would enter through a road, and this road would have a checkpoint. And these were placed there not only to defend the territory from invasion, but also to serve as customs, as a checkpoint to check for valuables. Bureaucracy was also a very juicy opportunity for taxation. As the state became more complex, the demand of official recognition of agreements between individuals became more pronounced. The state became more and more an arbiter of important transactions. For example, you couldn't just build your house at the outskirts of a Roman colony. The land had to be yours, you had to prove it, the proof had to be kept somewhere centralized, and the state had the right to at least be informed if you built something there. All of this generated a demand for administrative work, and whenever something had an administrative side to it, like a will, an inheritance, the formal sale of something valuable like a house, these were also much easier to tax because they depended on this official recognition and a certain level of enforcement from the authorities. Therefore, the state had the perfect reason to charge a fee for this enforcement. So now that we know it was much harder to tax things back then, Rome, of course, did what it could to extract money from its citizens, and this gave rise to some pretty unique taxes. The first one we're exploring today is the tributum capitis, the tax on being, well, alive. Yeah, we have a modern name for this. It would be a poll tax or a capitation tax, and it is as simple as it sounds, a payment attached directly to a person. It worked perfectly within the practical limits of ancient taxation, because the state did not need to know what you earned or if your business was doing well. It only needed to establish that you existed and belonged to the taxable population of an area. So you were the thing being taxed. This is why the Romans came up with something like the census, the registry, the periodic registry of every person in their territories, as it told the state who lived where, how many taxable people were in each household, and in this way they could optimize how much to tax from each city and from each person. So once you and your family were counted, part of the census would also be an estimation on how much you had, how many houses you had, how much land you had, what was your property, how big your family was, how fertile was maybe the land where you lived was. Then, once they had all of this information, and the census information was highly complex, it wasn't hard for the states to come up with a formula on how much they would calculate taxes, and then, based on all of that information, give you a bill. Based on yourself, your family, and how much you had, here's your tax for simply existing. And not every person had the same value in the eyes of the Roman state. Roman society was divided into very clear social categories, from the slaves, freedmen, plebeians, equestrians, all the way up to patricians. And the amount you paid, or whether you paid this tax at all, depended on where you stood within that hierarchy. So people living in Italy or Roman citizens generally didn't pay this tax. That would depend on which period of Roman history we're talking about, of course, but generally this tax was imposed on the provinces. So woe to the vanquished. If you lived under Roman banners, you had to pay a tax. Where you lived in these provinces also changed your tax. Let's say, for example, that you were a citizen of a city from a region recently conquered by Rome. If you happen to be from a city that supported Rome during its conquest, it's likely that you would enjoy a reduced rate, or maybe even an exemption. On the other hand, if you were part of a rebellious group, like for example the Jews after the Jewish revolt of 70 AD, you would have to pay an extra. In the case of the Jews, they had to pay the fiscus judaicus, which was a surcharge of 2 denarii per year per person. And it wasn't just the fact that you were alive that could have given you a tax obligation. Whether you were married or not was also taxable. There was a kind of bachelor's tax. One of the earliest examples appears in 403 BC, when Roman censors, a censor was an official given the responsibility of overseeing public morals, they imposed a tax called the aes uxorium, literally a payment charged to men who had reached adulthood but still refused to marry. The objective was not simply to raise money. Rome wanted more marriages, more legitimate children, and eventually more citizens to serve in the army and support the state. The tax itself was added to the bachelor's assessment during the census, meaning the authorities already had your name, your property, where you lived, and most importantly, the fact that you had no wife. So, if you wanted to continue playing around, sure, be my guest, but you will have to pay. Sadly, we don't know exactly how much this tax was, so we cannot say how many coins a Roman bachelor had to surrender each year, but the fact this tax even existed, it's pretty crazy. During the reign of Augustus, he doubled down on the bachelor's tax. His marriage laws capped the tax and punished unmarried people by preventing them from receiving certain inheritances, meaning that refusing to marry could cost you not only a yearly payment, but an entire fortune left to you in someone's will. Augustus wasn't doing this simply because he wanted to regulate Roman morals. He actually had a genuine concern with the size of the native Roman population. By the end of his reign, after greatly expanding Rome's territories, the census reported around 50 million people living in Roman lands. Of these, only 10% were full Roman citizens. Augustus knew that Rome needed Roman families to produce the soldiers and the colonists who would control these vast territories, and he wanted to preserve what he saw as pure Roman citizen stock, let's say, from being diluted inside a much larger provincial world. So encouraging marriage and punishing bachelors was not really about interfering with people's lives and trying to make some money. It was his view of attempting to make sure that the empire, let's say, continued being purely Roman. For you to have an idea, one of the population groups within the empire that probably outnumbered those with full citizen rights were the slaves. Rome's conquests brought millions of new slaves to work in the Roman economy, and those were counted and registered in the census, the slaves, not as persons, but as res. Res is Latin for thing. A slave was meant to be a registered good with an assigned owner, just like a car today. And every time a slave was freed, either the slave or the master had to pay a tax for the privilege. So you had to pay a tax on your freedom. A master could, for example, free a slave through a legal process known as manumission. This was a formal procedure, so it had to be performed before a magistrate. You could also do it through, like, when the census time came, or you could write it on your will, and once you died, your slave was free. Once this freedom became official, the former slave, he or she became a freedman. So before this transformation was complete, the state collected a tax. This was called the vicesima libertatis. This was a tax equal to 5% of a slave's value. And the more we try to put ourselves into the situation of paying this tax, the crazier it sounds, because many slaves managed to buy their freedom after years of working on the side and saving money. So imagine you were a slave, and right when you were about to be freed, certainly a very emotional moment in the life of any slave, you had to stand in front of a public official, and they had to once again assess how much you were worth. Let's say you were bought when you were a young man, very fit for like manual labor, so you might have been expensive as a merchandise back then. But what if your master taught you how to write because he needed one of his slaves to, let's say, serve as a scribe? You could be faced with the situation where you had to pay a high tax because now, at the time you got your freedom, you were a more expensive piece of human labor. Even if you were about to become a free person, imagine how insane it would have been to be in this situation. The justification, the rationale behind this tax is that freedom had to be officially recognized. It was not enough for a master to simply tell a slave, hey, you're free now. The state had to change that person's legal status, remove the now free person from their owner's property and guarantee their new freedom under Roman law. This also meant adding another free person to the registries of Roman society. Since Rome controlled the entire legal process, it had the perfect opportunity in this bureaucracy machine to charge for the service. The state was basically saying, like, you can stop being someone else's property, but first we want 5% of what you were worth. There was also maybe a darker reason behind this bureaucracy. It wasn't in Rome's best interest to have a decreasing number of cheap labor, of slaves. It wanted to have plenty of slaves inside Roman's territory to work in their economy. So whenever they could put inconveniences behind freeing slaves, they would probably do so. Alright, we've established that Rome was willing to tax your life, your marriage, and even your freedom. So why stop here? Rome also taxed sex. In the year 40 AD, Emperor Caligula introduced a tax on prostitution as part of a much wider group of new taxes he imposed to try to plug the huge hole in the public finances he made from his very generous spending. Prostitution was perfectly legal in the Roman Empire, even though prostitutes and pimps were considered socially disgraceful and suffered very serious legal restrictions because of their profession. But in the point of view from the state, prostitution was also a large and very visible business. Prostitution was everywhere. It wasn't just in brothels. They also worked in taverns, baths, in all kinds of public spaces. So it was a type of high visibility business that was easy to control. And this was exactly the kind of economic activity that Rome had the conditions of taxing. According to the historian Suetonius, the amount of this tax was whatever each prostitute charged for one sexual encounter. So if a prostitute charged 1 denarius to sleep with a client, the state would demand 1 denarius as a tax. This was actually quite a clever way of estimating how much each person could afford to pay. More expensive prostitutes paid a higher amount, while those who charged less also paid less. The state, of course, did not need to follow every client into the brothel and calculate the percentage of every transaction. It only needed to establish the normal price charged by each sex worker and then collected the value of one of those transactions. Now, we don't know exactly how often this payment was demanded. Some historians believe it was collected every day, which would mean the state was basically taking the income from one client every single day. And personally, especially considering Roman taxation was generally very light, this feels like an excessive number. Other historians believe it was a monthly payment, which actually fits better with evidence from some of the provinces that have been recorded, so we can extrapolate this to Rome itself, and so a monthly bill is more reasonable. Another thing I think it's curious about this tax is how they chose how much to tax for each prostitute, because by charging based on the price of each individual session, let's put it this way, this particular tax became effectively quite similar to how our modern income tax works. The more you earn, the more you pay. How this tax was collected also has a fascinating story behind it. So Caligula originally handed the collection of these new taxes to the publicani. These were private tax collectors. Publicani, what they did was they paid for the right to collect a certain type of tax. So they paid the estimated revenue to the state up front, how much they estimated to collect with this tax, and then these publicani received the right to collect the tax and make a profit by extracting basically as much money as possible from the people who owned it. So they made a little niche where they could exploit the tax. Apparently, the tax revenue for this particular tax was so high, they made so much money, so much more money than Caligula expected, that the emperor eventually removed the publicani from this particular source of income and handed the collection over to centurions and tribunes of the Praetorian Guard, mind you, because these were more trustworthy to handle and there was so much money flowing in. So imagine being a prostitute in Rome and having an armed member, not a normal guard from the city patrol or a normal soldier, but an elite soldier from the emperor's personal guard arriving at your doorstep and demanding your monthly tax. So when Caligula saw the huge money-making opportunity with this tax, he expanded it, the scope of the tax. He actually became very predatory with this decree, and he did so by expanding the taxable population. The tax was imposed not only on active prostitutes, but also on pimps, anyone working alongside the trade, and even on people who had worked in prostitution in the past. Leaving the profession and getting married, for example, did not remove your obligation. Here's yet another situation where the census once again helped Rome a lot. Once the Roman state had identified and registered you as someone involved in prostitution at any point, that label would continue following you even after you left the profession. This tax on prostitution also generated some interesting conflicts with Rome's concepts of morality. In the 3rd century, Emperor Severus Alexander did not want money collected from prostitutes and pimps entering the treasury, which he thought was sacred and pure, so he directed it towards more mundane uses like maintaining the stadiums, the circuses. Even the maintenance of the Colosseum was, for a time, fully funded by this tax. What's interesting is that the state marked this source of money as dirty, as low class, but that same state also kept that money. How convenient. So much for Roman good morals. It simply found a place to spend it that felt less dishonorable. Under the later Christian Empire, this idea that the government was financially benefiting from what was now officially considered a sin, it made this tax really hard to justify. And eventually, Emperor Anastasius abolished the tax in 498 AD. This might have been one of Rome's longest standing taxes. It was in effect for 4 centuries at least. Hi, I'm Leo, the voice behind Classical Numismatics, and if you want to learn how to collect ancient coins but don't know where to start, I have the solution for you. In my course, The Ancient Coin Collector, I will teach you everything you need to know in order to enjoy ancient numismatics like you deserve. You will learn how to buy ancient coins, how to avoid fakes, how to pay the right price, how to identify coins. You will learn everything you absolutely must know. The links are in the video description below. Join us! Alright, we got taxes on your life, on your marriage, on your freedom, and taxes on your sexual escapades. Where else could Rome possibly tax you? Now, the most famous of Rome's strange taxes was imposed on something even less dignified: urine. During the reign of Emperor Vespasian in the 70s AD, The state began charging for the commercial collection and use of urine from public toilets. This was not literally a tax charge every time someone went to relieve themselves. The people being taxed were those who collected the urine and used it as a material in their businesses. Yes, urine actually had commercial value in ancient Rome. That's because chemically, urine is actually very unique. When you leave it standing for some time, it produced ammonia, which made it surprisingly useful for cleaning and processing fabrics. Like laundry workers, for example, used it to remove grease and dirt from clothes, as ammonia is a super powerful bleaching agent, so it dissolved all kinds of sweat and dirt from clothes. Urine was also very useful when processing fabrics, hides, stuff like leather. Leather, for example, is very hard to manipulate when it's raw. It's very stiff. So ammonia was used to soften it. Only after going through some kind of treatment could it be shaped into something like a pair of shoes. So tanners also had a use for this unusual material. And I mean, this tax on urine was very easy to be implemented. All they had to do was to control the public collection points in places like public latrines and charge the businesses that arrived to collect it. The product was clearly visible, it was concentrated in certain places, and all you had to do was to place someone there controlling the collection of urine. Emperor Vespasian, the creator of this weird tax, he had inherited an empire whose finances were severely damaged by civil war, so he became actually famous for finding revenue wherever he could. He was a very pragmatic man. He was not particularly concerned about where that money came from. Actually, there's this interesting episode where his son, Titus, supposedly complained that profiting from urine was disgusting. So his father answered by holding a coin from the very first payment of the tax of this collection under his nose and asking whether it smelled of something. When Titus said that it did not, Vespasian reminded him that the coin had come from urine. This story gave rise to the famous expression pecuniam non olet. Money doesn't stink. There's no such thing as shameful money. It may have come from a very foul-smelling source, but hey, once that denarius reached the Roman treasury, it was worth the same as any other coin. And for our final example of weird taxes, we have this fascinating example of a tax created to fund gladiatorial matches. We all know about the concept of bread and circuses, to keep the masses entertained and complacent with accessible entertainment and cheap food. Gladiator fights were massively popular. They attracted enormous crowds and helped keep the large urban population of Roman cities relatively peaceful. The Roman elite, therefore, had a strong incentive in keeping the games going. However, this was expensive. Public games had always been a nice way for aristocrats to gain support with the population. Hosting such events gave someone dignitas. It gained them like public reputation. So a good reputation was indispensable for anyone with higher political ambitions. But not only was it very expensive, but over time, providing these spectacles stopped being just like a voluntary gift to the people, and it actually became an official responsibility attached to certain public offices. The entertainment industry eventually became so large that by the 2nd century AD, paying for spectacles had become a serious financial drain on budgets of most Roman cities. There's this very interesting example. It was a decree discovered in a Roman colony in Spain. This decree dates from the reign of Marcus Aurelius, and it was a law requiring the city's 2 chief magistrates, the duumvirs. These were similar to the 2 consuls that rule over Rome, but in a smaller scale on a colony. Now, this law mandated that they organize 4 days of gladiatorial matches or some kind of theatrical performance per term of service. Each of the 2 magistrates had to contribute at least 2,000 sesterces from their own pockets, while the city could provide another 2,000 from public funds. So sadly, the common citizens weren't off the hook when it came to paying for their own entertainment. They had a direct fee to pay. And actually, knowing in hindsight how taxes work, it's likely that they actually paid all of it, because the duumvirs, the ones who had to pay 4,000 sesterci, they could actually raise the local capitation taxes, for example, or they could find some way of recovering this money from exploiting the population. Once the money was collected, it would be given to the ediles. These were lower-ranking magistrates who had in their list of obligations the organization of the local games and any other forms of entertainment for the masses. Since the ediles, or aediles in an anglicized form, they too were part of the aristocracy, they were just in the beginning of their political careers, they too were expected to chip in from their own funds if they wanted any future chances of growing in their public image and rising through the political ranks. Something else that's interesting about this edict is that the amount established by law was actually just the minimum. Magistrates actually competed to provide more gladiators, more exotic animals, and longer spectacles because that was expected of them. Being cheap while in public office was analogous to political suicide. And this competition for making better, more lavish games pushed costs of events so high that emperors eventually had to pivot on their policy of flamboyant games, and they regulated the prices charged for gladiators. The second part of this decree places limits on how much could be spent. So if you wanted the prestige of becoming a high-ranking magistrate, be ready to pay a very hefty sum for the privilege. Oh, it's also worth mentioning, public positions were not paid. You didn't get a salary for being a consul. It was meant to be part of your public duty. That's one of the reasons why only the elite reached these positions, because it could get incredibly expensive very fast. If you wanted to be consul, for example, you had to spend a fortune. And you know what? After researching for this episode, it made me feel less bad about how many taxes I have to pay. Not necessarily because I enjoy doing it, it's more like I'm not the only one being crushed by it. Our friends the Romans, so many years ago, they also had to suffer under this timeless, oppressive force of tax collectors. At least it gives us a sense of connection to them. We are united through time to the Romans, not only by having once held these lovely coins you see here, but we both have had the fear of seeing a public official in the distance, rushing towards us trying to take money away from our pockets. I guess some things never really change. So how about you? Do you have any examples of weird or interesting taxes that the Romans used to charge? Let me know in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Leave a like and consider subscribing if you did. Happy collecting, and I'll see you soon. Let me give a special thank you to all of my amazing channel members and Patreons for their generous support. This channel would not be the same without your help. And if you would like to be part of this list, have early access to my videos when they are uploaded to YouTube, and a series of other perks, make sure to check out my Patreon page and my members tab on YouTube. Thank you very much.